A quiet street, a vanished man, and a ticking clock. Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. This community thrives on curiosity. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Hearing from you always brings these mysteries to life. Let's dive in. It was still dark when Maigret awoke. He had not set an alarm, but something, perhaps the weight of the air, perhaps the muffled echo of footsteps in the courtyard, stirred him from sleep a few minutes before 6. He sat on the edge of the bed, feet planted on the cold linoleum floor, the room silent except for the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of rain brushing against the window panes. Madame Maigret slept on, her hair coiled neatly as always, the curve of her shoulder rising and falling in slow breaths beneath the woolen blanket. Maigret dressed without turning on the lamp, pulling on his heavy trousers and cardigan, the one with a patch on the elbow. He was due nowhere this early. No summons had come in. No body had been discovered. Still he moved as if in response to something. Not urgency, but habit. A certain heaviness in the bones that told him it was going to be one of those days. He lit his pipe at the kitchen table and watched the rain trail down the glass, the scent of damp soot from the stove mingling with the smell of tobacco. The building opposite was only a silhouette, its windows pale with drawn curtains. Down the hall the concierge's broom dragged across the tiled floor, an ordinary sound, though today it scratched at him slightly. He glanced at the telephone. Silent, no blinking light, nothing yet. Madame Maigret stirred and appeared tying her robe. "Did you sleep poorly?" she asked softly. "No worse than usual," he replied. She filled the enamel coffee pot and placed it on the stove, moving gently so as not to startle the morning. They sat together at the table without speaking, the kind of silence that comes from long companionship. He looked at her hands as she folded them around her cup. She had been reading a novel last night, something English. She always preferred the ones with quiet gardens and unpleasant aunts. After a time she said, "You've that look again." "What look?" "As if something's bothering you, but it hasn't happened yet." He smiled faintly. "Maybe nothing will." But he doubted it. By 8, Maigret had made his way to Quai des Orfèvres. The corridors were cold, the radiators clanking inconsistently, as if reluctantly agreeing to their task. He greeted the desk sergeant with a nod, hung his coat on the peg outside his office, and opened the window a crack. The rain had eased, but Paris still smelled like wet iron and tobacco and last night's wine. Inside the office, a pile of papers waited on his desk, most of it bureaucratic noise. Transfers, disputes over jurisdiction, a note about Inspector Lognon's latest complaint, this time involving a bakery that had failed to deliver his croissants. He looked through the blinds at the grey Seine and waited. It was not that he knew a crime had occurred. It was simply that he could feel a small silent current pulling at him, the vague, unsettling sense that someone somewhere had made a decision that would not stay quiet for long. Then, just past 9, a knock. Young Inspector Janvier poked, his head in, damp from the rain, holding his hat in one hand. "Sorry, Chief. There's a woman downstairs, says her husband left for work this morning and never got there." Maigret didn't move. "That's not unusual," he said. "No, but she says he left at dawn, that he looked different, and that he never takes his coat when it rains. But today, he did." She says she felt something, was wrong before he even closed the door. Maigret rose slowly and buttoned his coat. "Where is she?" "In the waiting room, nervous type." "Let's see." The woman was perhaps in her early 40s. Her clothes were plain and conservative, a brown wool coat, a hat with a small veil, practical shoes. She sat stiffly in the wooden chair, a damp umbrella between her knees, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Maigret entered without introduction and sat opposite her. "You're Madame, D'Estrées, Colette D'Estrées." She did not offer her hand. Her voice was small and steady, but there was a tension in her mouth. Not fear, not quite sadness, a kind of bracing against something. Maigret said nothing for a moment, watching her. She bore it awkwardly, shifting slightly under his gaze. "I know it must sound foolish," she began. "He's only been gone a few hours, but we've been married 17 years. He works at the customs office near Gare Saint-Lazare, leaves at the same time every morning, drinks his coffee, wipes the handle of his umbrella. You notice these things after a while. And this morning, he didn't touch his toast. He folded his napkin before eating. He only does that when he's made a decision. And when I asked whether he needed his briefcase, he said no." Maigret lit his pipe. "He left at what time?" 5:40, that's too early. He doesn't need to leave until 6:30, and it was raining. "But this morning he wore his coat." She nodded. "The long one with the scarf I gave him last Christmas." "And you've tried calling the office?" "They said he never arrived." Maigret didn't write anything down. He leaned back slightly. "What sort of man is your husband, Madame d'Estrées?" She hesitated. "A quiet man. Precise. He likes things to be in their place." "Did he seem worried lately? Distant?" Again she hesitated. I think he's been sleeping less. Not restless, just watching the ceiling." Maigret stood. "We'll see what we can find out." She looked as if she wanted to say more, to offer a detail or a guess, but no words came. Janvier met Maigret in the corridor. "Is it something?" Maigret pulled on his coat. "I don't know yet, but he left at dawn. That's always a peculiar hour." As Maigret stepped into the rain again, his pipe smoke curling through the mist, he wondered not where Monsieur d'Estrées had gone, but what had shifted so quietly to make an ordinary man walk out before sunrise, dressed like someone going far away. The rain had softened into mist by the time Maigret reached Rue de l'Église, a narrow side street lined with modest apartment buildings and boulangeries shuttered for the morning. The grey facades gleamed with moisture, and the only sounds were the occasional echo of footsteps and the hush of tires rolling slowly through puddles. It was a quiet quarter, the kind of street where lives pass unnoticed, framed by lace curtains and routine. Number 14 was a narrow building with pale blue shutters and a wooden door softened by years of use. Maigret pressed the bell marked D'Estrées and waited. No answer. He buzzed again, then turned to scan the windows above. No twitching curtains, no curious glances. The silence of the house matched the silence of the street. Ordinary, unremarkable, almost deliberately so. He turned to leave, but a voice called from behind. "You're looking for Monsieur d'Estrées." A woman in her 60s leaned from the window across the street. She wore a thick grey sweater and held a dripping cloth in one hand, as if caught, midway through cleaning. "I might be," Maigret replied. "You know him?" "Who doesn't? Been here 15 years, always at the same time, same step, same umbrella. Clockwork." Maigret crossed over. "Did you see him this morning?" She frowned slightly. "I did, actually. I thought it strange." "How so?" "He never leaves before 6. Today it was still dark. I noticed the coat first, long black. You don't forget the shape in this weather, and the way he looked up and down the street before walking off, like someone waiting to be sure he wouldn't be seen." "Did he carry anything?" "No briefcase, just his umbrella. But I tell you something, he wasn't walking to the station. He went the other way." "Which direction?" She pointed left toward the church square. "Much obliged, madame." Maigret tipped his hat and returned to the building. With no answer from the bell, he turned the brass knob and pushed. The door yielded. Inside, the air was stale and faintly scented with floor polish and boiled vegetables. A steep staircase led upward in a narrow spiral, lit only by dim skylight. Apartment 3B, according to the building file Janvier had retrieved, belonged to the Destres. On the third-floor landing, Maigret knocked. No reply. He tried the handle. Locked. He stood a moment, pipe unlit between his fingers. The hall was silent. Only the faint creak of wood beneath his feet and the far-off hum of a radio behind one of the doors. He went back down and rang the concierge's bell. A minute later, a squat man in shirt sleeves emerged from the side passage, wiping his hands with a rag. "Concierge? That's me. Something is wrong upstairs? Chief Inspector Maigret. I'd like to look inside apartment 3B. The man squinted. Monsieur Destres? Yes. Madame Destres's already gone to the police, hasn't she? She has. I'd still like to see inside. The man nodded and disappeared into his quarters, returning with a ring of keys. Together they climbed the stairs, the concierge breathing heavily. I always liked him, you know, the man said. Quiet fellow, never a problem, bit rigid perhaps, but polite. Never missed rent. Always had a tie on, even on Sundays. They reached the door. The concierge inserted the key, turned, and stepped aside. Maigret entered. The apartment was as orderly as expected. A narrow corridor opened into a sitting room with a dining nook and a small kitchen to the left. To the right, 2 doors, likely the bedroom and bath. Everything was in its place. Cushions aligned, shoes neatly stored on a rack. A calendar by the phone showed a red circle around last Thursday. Maigret walked slowly, touching nothing, only observing. The smell was faintly medicinal, not unpleasant but sterile. He paused at the coat rack. Madame d'Estrées had said her husband wore the long coat. Here was the short one, still damp from 2 days ago, hanging by its familiar hook. The scarf he'd taken was not here. He stepped into the bedroom. The bed was made precisely. A pair of slippers at the foot. On the nightstand a book, the Customs Manual, 1947 edition. He opened the top drawer. Neatly folded socks, cufflinks in a small tin, and a sheaf of receipts clipped together. In the second drawer he found something more curious, a notebook, plain black cover. Inside, a list of dates and times, some circled. No headings, no names. Just 11/4, 1725, 13/4, 1750, 15/4, 1805 rain. About 2 dozen such entries, the last one marked 3/5, 540, D for dawn, perhaps? Or something else. He pocketed the notebook. In the kitchen, 2 coffee cups stood on the drain board, both recently washed. Madame d'Estrées hadn't mentioned anyone else being there. 1 cup could have been hers, but he wondered why neither had been dried. He opened the bin. Coffee grounds, a piece of orange peel, and a torn envelope. He reached in, smoothed the paper. Madame Colette d'Estrées, 14, Rue de l'Église, Paris, 19. No sender. The paper inside was missing. Maigret folded the envelope and kept it. At last he turned to the concierge. Have you noticed anyone else coming and going recently? Any guests? Not that I know of. We don't get many visitors in this building. People keep to themselves. Anyone unusual in the last few weeks? The concierge scratched his head. Well, I suppose. There's the man with the limp. Maigret raised an eyebrow. He's been seen coming down the back stairs a few times. No one knows who he is, never uses the front door. When did you last see him? 2 nights ago, around 6, maybe later. He didn't look up. Would you recognize him again? Possibly. Maigret nodded. That'll do for now. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, he sat in silence at his desk. The notebook lay open beside the torn envelope. He stared at the final entry again, 540D, and lit his pipe. Janvier tapped on the door. "We checked the customs office. D'Estrées hasn't shown since Friday. His supervisor says he had a routine assignment last week. Nothing strange." "No friends there?" "None mentioned." Maigret tapped the notebook with his finger. "These are meetings or observations, regular, increasing." He leaned back. Something shifted for D'Estrées. He broke his pattern. Whatever it wasn't panic, it was planned. He didn't say what he was thinking, that the man hadn't vanished in fear, but in resolve. Something had ended on the morning of May 3rd. Or perhaps something had begun. Maigret often said that cases revealed themselves not in offices, but in cafés, over too sweet coffee, smudged mirrors, and half-heard conversations. That morning he walked aimlessly after reviewing D'Estrées' notes again. The clouds had lifted somewhat, but a low haze still hovered above the Seine like steam from a slow-cooked stew. The city had resumed its rhythm, delivery carts rattling, tram bells clanging, and Parisians hunched in coats, indifferent to mysteries unless they touched their own doorstep. He made his way on foot toward the direction Madame d'Estrées' neighbor had indicated, the opposite direction from the customs office, toward the older quarter behind the church. A place where older buildings leaned slightly, where brasseries served the same menu for 50 years, and where people who wanted not to be noticed could disappear in plain view. He turned onto Rue du Fer à Moulin, then into a narrower side, street lined with crooked shutters and a hint of old wine barrels in the gutters. It smelled faintly of yeast and dog. Maigret paused in front of a corner café with fogged windows and a painted sign that read, "Le Petit Saint-Honoré," the sort of place where the regulars turned around when someone new entered. It was nearly 10, but a few figures lingered inside, a man reading the sports pages with his scarf still on, an older woman with a knitting basket, and a boy behind. The bar polishing glasses with theatrical care. Maigret stepped inside. The warmth was immediate and smelled of damp wool, tobacco, and coffee that had stewed too long on the burner. The boy looked up. "Un demi?" he offered automatically. "Just a coffee," Maigret said. He settled into a worn banquette in the corner, pipe tucked into his coat pocket, eyes roaming the mirrored wall. A cracked poster for a circus from 3 years ago still clung beside the menu. None of the patrons paid him much attention. Yet. The boy brought his coffee and lingered, wiping the table, although it was clean. "Do many people come early here?" "Some. Workers, retired ones, people waiting for others." "Anyone with a limp?" The boy blinked. "There's a man, sits by the window, drinks hot wine, doesn't talk. Limp on the right side, one foot drags." Maigret stirred his coffee, watching the cream swirl. "When was he last in?" "Yesterday morning before 8. "Does he meet anyone?" The boy shrugged. "He watches, doesn't speak much." Maigret left a coin beside his saucer. "If he comes again, call this number." He handed the boy a card already prepared with his office line. The boy took it without reading. Outside again, Maigret felt the rain threaten, but not commit. He stood beneath the striped awning for a moment and lit his pipe, watching the corner window of the café. He imagined D'Estrées seated there, coat damp, umbrella closed beside him. Meeting someone or watching? Back at the office, he found Janvier reading the latest police circular with theatrical boredom. "Anything from the missing persons files?" Maigret asked. Janvier shook his head. "Nothing on D'Estrées. But we did check medical records. No history of mental illness, no debts, no large cash withdrawals. Check the staff at Gare Saint-Lazare. See if anyone recalls seeing him, or a man with a limp. Monday or the days before. Janvier nodded and left. Maigret lit his pipe and returned to the apartment notebook. He stared at the entries again. Not dates of meetings, perhaps, but of observations. They became more frequent in the last week, as if d'Estrées was zeroing in on something. The door creaked open. Madame d'Estrées stood hesitantly, gloved hands clasped around a purse. "I hope I'm not disturbing—" Maigret rose and gestured to the chair. "Not at all, madame. Please." She sat back straight. "I wondered whether you had found anything." "I'm not sure yet," Maigret said carefully, "but I'd like to ask a few more questions." "Of course. Has your husband ever spoken of anyone with a limp?" Her brow furrowed. "No, why?" "There may be someone he was watching or meeting." She shook her head. "He didn't talk much about work or people. He kept things internal. That's been my impression." She seemed about to speak, then thought better of it. "Madame," Maigret said gently, "even small things may help. Something odd, something said once." Her eyes drifted toward the window. She exhaled. "There was a night last week. He was late. Not very, maybe an hour. But he said he'd met a man who reminded him of his brother." "Did he have a brother?" "He died in childhood. Diphtheria." "Did he say why the man reminded him?" "No, he seemed unsettled, not frightened, but shaken. After that he was quieter." Maigret nodded slowly. "Was there anything different in his habits?" She paused again. "He took long walks after dinner. I heard his footsteps when he came in, always light, but that week they were heavier, as if he'd walked farther." "Did he ever mention a place called Le Petit Saint-Honoré?" She shook her head. "I don't think so." Maigret studied her. "You mentioned he was precise, predictable." "Yes, but that last morning he was neither." "No." She looked at him, and her voice changed subtly. "Do you think he's alive, Inspector?" "I think he left with purpose, and people with purpose are often alive longer than those who panic." It was not reassurance, but it settled her. Later that afternoon, Janvier returned with a file under one arm and a wet coat. 2 rail staff remembered d'Estrées. Not from this week, but last Thursday. He was seen entering the east platform area, not boarding a train, just standing near the service track. "Did he speak to anyone?" "No, but one of the guards says he saw him talking to a man. Couldn't hear, but said the man had a limp." Maigret tapped his fingers on the edge of his desk. "Did they shake hands?" "No. The guard said the man with the limp looked angry, like someone giving instructions, or a warning." That night, Maigret stood on the bridge by the station, watching the platforms beneath flicker under weak electric lights. The air smelled of oil, rust, and the faint sweetness of cold bread. People passed him, heads down, collars raised. Trains came and went. A man could stand here for hours without notice, or arrange a meeting that no one would ever question. He took out the notebook again and turned to the last entry. 3-5, 5:40, D. A dawn meeting. Then, silence. And somewhere in Paris a man with a limp was still walking, quietly perhaps, but walking all the same. The following morning, Maigret woke earlier than usual. The light was pale and uncertain, the kind that makes one hesitate, before deciding whether to begin the day. He sat for a long while at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, pipe unlit, the smoke of yesterday still lingering somewhere behind his eyes. Madame Maigret had gone to the market already. Her shopping bag was missing from the hook by the door. The silence of the apartment reminded him of Rue de l'Église, not the stillness of peace, but of something held in suspension, like a breath not yet exhaled. He thought again of the final notebook entry, 35540 D. That would have been Monday morning, 3 days ago. A man does not rise before dawn and walk into the rain for nothing. By 9 o'clock, Maigret was back at D'Estrées' apartment. The concierge recognized him now, said nothing, and handed over the ring of keys without asking. Upstairs, apartment 3B was unchanged. The air had grown a touch mustier, the kind of scent that begins to gather after just a few days without movement. No windows opened, no meals cooked, no lives lived. Maigret walked slowly through each room, not with the expectation of discovering something obvious, but to feel the pattern of the space again. D'Estrées had been a man of routines, and in his routines there might be a crack, a hairline fracture that revealed what had gone unseen. In the bedroom, he sat on the edge of the neatly made bed and opened the nightstand drawer again. The notebook had already been removed, of course, but there were still receipts, a nail file, a small box containing a pair of cufflinks shaped, like miniature abacuses. A gift, perhaps. Maigret opened the bottom drawer this time. Old postcards bound with string, some with writing, some blank. A few from seaside towns, Dieppe, Étretat, Royan. The messages were simple. Lovely weather. Thinking of you. Back Wednesday. All signed simply C. Among them, one was more recent. The stamp bore a smudged date, just over a week ago. It read, "It was never about the money, you know that. But some things cannot be left buried. Tuesday, same place." Saint-Simon Maigret read it twice. There was no address, no names. The image on the card was a black and white photo of a quiet canal in Bruges. He tucked it into his coat pocket and stood. He returned to the kitchen. The cup rack still held 2 cups, though he now noticed that one had a hairline crack, nearly invisible unless you turned it toward the light. A small thing, insignificant, but he found himself wondering which one D'Estrées used, and which had been left for a guest. Then, something else. He opened the upper cabinet beside the stove. Tins of sardines, neat rows of beans, a half-used box of pasta. And at the very back, tucked behind a tall tin of cocoa, a bottle of plum brandy, unopened. Madame D'Estrées had never mentioned her husband drank. He removed the bottle and examined the seal. Intact. Next to it was a glass. Clean, but with the faintest trace of a ring at the bottom, recently used, then washed. He closed the cupboard and returned the brandy. It wasn't much. Not yet. But in Maigret's experience, people reveal themselves not through confessions, but through the objects they leave behind. Things not meant to be noticed. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret placed the postcard gently on his desk and stared at it while the city clattered outside. He imagined D'Estrées receiving it. No address, so hand-delivered, perhaps slipped under the door or left in the mailbox downstairs. Same place. Tuesday. That would be the week before D'Estrées vanished. Was that the day he stood near the station speaking with the man who had the limp? He summoned Janvier. "Any luck with the café watch?" Janvier shrugged. "Not yet. The boy says he hasn't seen the limping man again. But he's watching." Maigret passed him the postcard. "Found this in D'Estrées' nightstand." Janvier read it slowly. Cryptic. He was meeting someone from his past. This wasn't extortion. It wasn't fear. It was obligation. C could be anyone, or no one. Sometimes letters mean more to the recipient than to us. Maigret stood and walked to the window. The Seine moved sluggishly below. A barge passed, dragging grey water in its wake. "Check something for me," he said without turning. Did D'Estrées have any previous postings in Bruges, or customs work on the Belgian border? On it. That afternoon, Maigret made his way on foot to the Ministry archives. A walk helped him think. Paris was between showers again, and the puddles mirrored gaslights, and the sharp black curves of railings. Children shouted in courtyards, a dog barked into a drain. Inside the ministry, a sleepy clerk led him through long rows of record cabinets, the scent of dust and cardboard filling the corridors. D'Estrées' personnel file was retrieved with little fuss. Maigret read it at a narrow desk, his hat resting beside him. Nothing remarkable. Trained in Lyon, stationed at Calais for 2 years, then the border near Roubaix, later Dunkirk. Finally, transferred to Paris Customs in 1948. One entry stood out. September 1946, temporary suspension. No details, just the phrase and a reference code, internal report, 9246A. Maigret tapped the folder. The clerk returned reluctantly when called. "Can I see internal report 9246A? The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Old disciplinary file?" "Yes." 10 minutes later, it arrived, thinner than expected. Maigret read it slowly. Jean d'Estrées was temporarily suspended following procedural irregularities during a customs inspection in Lille. A shipment of medical goods was misreported. Internal inquiry cleared him of wrongdoing, but notes suggested inconsistencies in his report. No further action taken, reinstated after 3 weeks, transferred thereafter. A signature at the bottom, Commissioner C. Lemoine. Lemoine. C. Maigret stood, file in hand. "Do you have anything else on Commissioner Lemoine?" The clerk scratched his neck. "Retired. I think he moved south." "Where?" "No idea. Try pensions." That evening, Maigret sat in his office with the postcard propped against his teacup. Rain tapped against the window, like slow applause. The scent of old smoke clung to his coat. He thought of d'Estrées again, a man with a rigid schedule. A man who left before dawn with no luggage, no note. A man who had once been suspended, briefly, and then buried the episode so deeply that not even his wife knew. Someone had written to him, someone who signed only with a C, and d'Estrées had gone out to meet him, not for money, not for betrayal, but because something had remained unresolved. Maigret leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. It was not yet a crime, not yet a disappearance, not officially. It was still a silence, but silences had weight, and this one was growing heavier by the hour. The next morning, Paris yawned beneath a veil of soft drizzle. The city seemed reluctant to rouse itself fully. People moved slower, their umbrellas bobbing along slick pavements like hesitant beetles. Maigret sat at his desk, with a fresh pot of coffee beside him, and the familiar rustle of Janvier's paperwork in the next room as background music. He stared at the postcard again, then at the file from the ministry. Lemoine. The name was plain, unremarkable, but that small signature, just the letter C, tugged at something. Not blackmail, not a threat, a reminder. Janvier entered, a folded slip of paper in hand. "We have a lead on Commissioner Lemoine. He passed away in 1949. Liver complications. According to pension records." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "That's early." He'd retired the year before, quietly, no ceremony. "Family? A widow living in Moudon." Maigret stood and pulled on his coat. "Have them hold my calls." The train to Moudon was quiet. A dozen passengers, most of them older, slouched with newspapers or stared absently through rain-pocked windows. Maigret smoked in the open vestibule between carriages. The scent of wet metal and cigarette ash mingled with the rhythm of steel on steel. Moudon rose from the mist like something remembered rather than seen. Modest villas with moss-covered walls, narrow lanes shadowed by plane trees, and the quiet hum of distant traffic. He found the address without much trouble. A house set, slightly back from the road, with iron railings and a hydrangea bush leaning under the weight of water. He rang the bell and waited. A tall woman in her 70s answered. She wore a pale cardigan and had the air of someone who preferred solitude but had learned to accept visitors. "Yes? Madame Lemoine, I'm Chief Inspector Maigret." Her expression changed, not alarm, but a kind of weariness. "I thought they'd stopped with the visits." "They have. This is personal." She looked at him carefully, then stepped back and gestured toward the drawing room. Inside, it was warm and faintly perfumed. Lace curtains softened the outside world, and the mantel held a row of family photographs, all in black and white. "I haven't much to offer you, Inspector." "I'm not here for tea," Maigret said gently. "I'm here about Jean d'Estrées." She stiffened, just slightly. "My husband knew many men. I remember few of them. He worked with d'Estrées in Lille. There was an inquiry, a suspended shipment. I don't recall the specifics. There were many. But you knew d'Estrées, at least by name." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Maigret lit his pipe, watching her in the silence that followed. "When did your husband retire?" "Autumn of '48. And he died the following spring?" "Yes." "Did he mention d'Estrées?" "Before he died?" Her lips tightened. "No." Maigret said nothing. He let the silence stretch. Sometimes the absence of noise drew more truth than direct questions. Finally she spoke. He blamed himself. For the inquiry? For not stepping in. He thought d'Estrées had done something foolish, not illegal but naive. Trusted someone, looked the other way. When the auditors came through, Jean had no choice. Was there money involved? She shook her head. It was always more complicated than that. A favor, a family friend, a delivery rerouted. By the time it reached Jean's desk, the facts had blurred. He signed off, then panicked. And d'Estrées? He was the scapegoat, quiet, dependable, the kind of man who wouldn't make a fuss. Maigret nodded. Did they see each other after that? No, but a card arrived, 2 weeks before Jean died. Just initials. J.D., nothing else. No return address. Do you still have it? I kept it. I don't know why. She rose and disappeared into another room. When she returned, she held a small envelope, brittle at the corners, yellowed with time. Maigret opened it. Inside was a single sentence. I still carry it. No greeting, no sign-off. He looked up. Did your husband reply? She hesitated. I don't know. Maigret folded the card and handed it back. Madame, was your husband a kind man? She looked toward the window, the lace curtain trembling slightly with the breeze. No. But he was loyal. To the wrong people sometimes. Maigret thanked her and left. Back in Paris, he returned to the station, though not to his desk. Instead, he walked the length of the east platform at Gare Saint-Lazare, the one d'Estrées had reportedly visited before his disappearance. It was quieter now. Between trains. A few porters stacked luggage. A woman with a small dog spoke sternly into a payphone. Maigret moved slowly, eyes tracing the cracks in the pavement, the smudges on the benches, the rainwater pooled at the platform's edge. He stopped near the service track. There was nothing special about the spot. No plaque, no booth, no cover from the rain. But he could imagine d'Estrées standing there, not boarding, not waiting, but looking, perhaps remembering, perhaps waiting for someone who might never arrive. He crossed to the gate leading to the service exit. A sign read, Personnel Only. Beyond it, a narrow stair descended into the underlevel, used by porters and maintenance. Workers. He showed his badge to the station guard. Anyone working here remember a man with a limp, visits in the early mornings? The guard frowned. There's someone like that. Comes twice a week. Used to be a cleaner, I think. Retired now, keeps to himself, drinks at the canteen. Name? Paul Cottard. Maigret's heart didn't leap. It settled into the next square of the puzzle. Where does he live? Down by Rue des Quatre Frères, a boarding house, top floor. By early evening, Maigret stood outside number 12 Rue des Quatre Frères, a chipped green building that leaned slightly inward, as if eavesdropping on itself. He climbed the narrow staircase slowly, past doors with peeling paint and the scent of frying oil and soap. At the top floor the corridor narrowed. He knocked. A minute passed before the door creaked open. The man was in his 60s, gaunt, grey stubble, one eye sunken, the other suspicious. He wore a sweater with holes at the cuffs and leaned slightly on the doorframe, his right foot turned inward. Yes? Paul Cottard? Who's asking? Chief Inspector Maigret. Cottard said nothing. The silence stretched. I'm not here about anything recent, Maigret added. I'm here about Jean d'Estrées. Cottard's expression changed, but only slightly, a flicker in the eyes, quickly hidden. Don't know the name. I think you do. You spoke to him on the platform. Last week. He's gone now. Cottard turned away, letting the door hang open. Inside was a room with 2 chairs, a cot and a gas burner. A window looked over grey rooftops. No books, no radio, just stillness. I didn't do anything to him. I didn't say you did. He came to me, said he had questions. What kind of questions? Cottard sat, his limp dragging, his body awkwardly. About a shipment, a name, from years ago. I told him to leave it alone, that nothing good came of digging. Maigret lit his pipe. Why did he come to you? I don't know. Maybe someone told him I used to work. The papers, I stamped crates, I looked the other way. You were part of the Lille shipment? Cottard stared at the floor. I was a nobody. I never took a franc, but I saw things. Things d'Estrées was too proper to see. Why now? Cottard said nothing for a long time. Then, because something was eating him. Maigret nodded slowly. And when he left, he said he understood, that he had to make peace with someone, I don't know who. Maigret stood. You'll stay in town? I've got nowhere else. Outside, the rain began again, soft and even. Maigret walked back toward the station, not quickly. He was beginning to see the shape of it now. Not a crime, but something older. A past wound reopening, slow and silent, demanding acknowledgement. Not every disappearance meant flight. Sometimes it meant return. Maigret was not the sort of man to be haunted. But as he walked home that evening, beneath a low, slate-colored sky, something in the rhythm of his steps refused to settle. A man had disappeared. Yeah, but it wasn't the absence that stayed with him. It was the feeling of something unfinished. Not interrupted, but left hanging, as if a line had been drawn across a page with the final letter left unwritten. He passed the Rue des Récollets and paused to light his pipe beneath an overhang. The scent of his tobacco mingled with the smells of early evening Paris, burnt sugar from a crêperie, damp bricks, the faintly acrid note of coal smoke from a basement stove. Somewhere a child cried and was hushed. A bicycle bell rang. Life was continuing as it always did, and yet somewhere in the sprawl of that life, Jean d'Estrées had ceased to take part. The next morning, Maigret rose without urgency. He drank his coffee slowly, staring through the kitchen window as Madame Maigret folded laundry in the other room. She didn't ask about the case, not yet, but he knew from the way she refolded the same towel twice that her curiosity was alive beneath. Her quiet manner. At the office, Janvier greeted him with a stack of papers. Cottard has no criminal record, Janvier said. "Not even petty theft. But there's a note in the 1946 archives. He was questioned during the Lille inquiry, but released without further interest. D'Estrées never mentioned him." "Because he didn't know him," Maigret murmured. "Not then. Should we bring him in formally?" Maigret shook his head. "No, he's not running." He tapped the desk lightly with his fingers. The files, the postcards, the conversations, they were circling something. But it wasn't a secret exactly. It was guilt, or shame, or perhaps both, blurred by time. Maigret stood. "I'm going to the chapel." Janvier blinked. "Which chapel?" "The one in the Parc Montsouris quarter, the Dominican one. I want to see if ghosts visit churches too." The chapel was small, tucked into a quiet side street behind iron railings and horse-chestnut trees. Maigret had passed it many times in his life but never entered. It was not a grand cathedral. The stone was soft with age, the doors low. Inside, the smell of wood polish and cold stone welcomed him. That and silence. Only 3 people sat in the pews, an old woman lighting a candle, a young man with his head bowed, and at the very back, near the gate, a man in a long coat. Maigret did not move for a long time. He sat 2 rows behind the man and simply watched. The figure was familiar, though older than the last photo in the customs file. Shoulders hunched, hands clasped, hat in his lap. His shoes were polished. There was a tear in one glove. His hair was thin but carefully combed, and Maigret saw something else, not fear, not even grief, stillness. He waited. 10 minutes passed. The man did not move. Finally, Maigret rose and walked the long arc of the aisle. He came to stand beside the man and spoke without preamble. "Monsieur d'Estrées." The man turned his head slowly. His eyes were not surprised. "I wondered when you'd come. You've been here the whole time?" "Since Tuesday evening." "Why here?" D'Estrées looked back toward the altar. "It's quiet. No one asks questions. They let you sit." Maigret settled beside him. The pew creaked faintly under their combined weight. "Your wife is worried." "I know. She reported you missing." "I expected she would. And yet you didn't leave Paris." "I didn't intend to disappear. Only to." "Can't withdraw." Maigret lit his pipe but did not smoke it. He held it in his hand, the bowl warming his fingers. "What happened?" D'Estrées gave a long exhale. "Do you remember the name Paul Cottard?" "I've spoken with him." D'Estrées nodded faintly. "I had forgotten him. Or I told myself I had, until I received that postcard." "From Lemoyne?" "Yes, before he died." "What did?" "You carry Monsieur d'Estrées?" The man was silent for a time. "In 1946, I signed off on a shipment that had no papers. I was told it was urgent medical equipment, war surplus redirected to hospitals. But it wasn't. It was mislabeled. Freight, black market pharmaceuticals, some stolen from Allied depots. I didn't know, or rather I didn't ask. I trusted the chain. Lemoyne protected you." "He closed the inquiry, but I was transferred quietly. I never asked why. I told myself I had been cleared, that it was political, bureaucratic." "But you didn't believe it?" "No, not really. Then the postcard came and something opened, something I'd locked shut." "And so you sought out Cottard?" "Yes, to ask, to confirm. He told me what I already knew, that I'd looked away when I should have questioned, that lives may have been affected, that money had changed hands." "But not yours." "No, never. I didn't want money. I wanted to be good at my job, respected, and I was for a time." Maigret watched him quietly. "Why not go home?" "I couldn't walk into our apartment and sit at that table knowing what I know now. I needed to. Sit with it." "In a chapel?" "Yes." Maigret nodded. Your wife deserves to know you're alive. I'll go this evening. I only needed to be ready." They sat in silence for a while, the echo of distant bells marking the hour. Finally Maigret rose. "I'll make no report." D'Estrées looked at him, almost gratefully. "I'm not sure I deserve that." Maigret smiled faintly. "It's not about deserving. It's about understanding you've already punished yourself." He placed a hand briefly on the man's shoulder and left the chapel, the heavy wooden door groaning as it closed behind him. That evening Maigret returned to his apartment. Madame Maigret was setting the table. "You're late," she said gently. There was a man in a chapel. She didn't ask further, only poured him a glass of wine. Over dinner she mentioned the price of apples and the baker's poor temper. He listened, grateful for her voice, steady, unassuming, familiar. And when the rain returned against the window, soft as breath, he sat with his pipe and watched it fall, the mystery now no longer a case, but a story, quiet, painful, human. A man had left at dawn, not to flee, but to remember. Madame Maigret had always said there were two kinds of return: the kind where a man comes back to what he left, and the kind where he returns having become something else entirely. That Thursday morning, Maigret stood across from Rue de l'Église again, under the same crooked awning where he had first spoken with the neighbor watching from her window. The woman wasn't there today. The street was quieter than usual, even for that hour. Rain fell steadily, soaking the shutters and darkening the doorsteps. It was the sort of rain that stayed in the bones. He didn't ring the bell this time. He waited. At 8:30 the front door opened. Jean d'Estrées emerged. He wore the same long coat, his scarf knotted carefully, the same umbrella with the horn handle he had carried on the morning of his departure. But he moved slower now. His expression was different, less composed, not broken, not sick, but humbled. He stepped into the street and noticed Maigret. Their eyes met. D'Estrées didn't look away. Maigret crossed. "Chief Inspector. Good morning. I was about to go for bread. My wife used to take care of it, but she's been avoiding errands, doesn't like the looks people give her. Do they know?" D'Estrées nodded. "She told them I'd been ill. It was easier than explaining the truth." They walked in. Silence toward the corner bakery, the sound of water pooling in the gutters like a slow clock ticking. A delivery van passed, leaving a curtain of mist in its wake. "Did she say anything when you came home?" Maigret asked. "She didn't need to. She just set the table, laid out the same plates, the same butter dish. I took off my coat and we sat. She asked if I wanted chicory in my coffee." "And did you?" "Yes." They stopped in front of the boulangerie, where a bored young man arranged pastries behind foggy glass. "I don't suppose you came here to see if I had survived the night," D'Estrées said, his tone flat but not unkind. "No, I came to ask you a question." D'Estrées turned to him. "Yes. Was there someone else involved?" "In what?" "In whatever it was that led you to leave. Someone who didn't want you asking questions. Someone who might want you quiet." D'Estrées thought for a moment. "No," he said. "Cottard didn't threaten me. He was resigned. I think he was surprised I came at all." "And the shipment?" "It's long gone. The records are dust. The men who profited have found other ways. I don't think I ever mattered much. That's what frightened me in the end. Not that I had done something wrong, but that my mistake had been so small it didn't even register." Maigret lit his pipe, shielding the flame from the rain with his palm. "Have you spoken to your wife about it?" "I told her the truth. Not all the dates, not every name, but I told her what I had carried, what I hadn't dared name." "And?" "She said she'd suspected something for years. Not the facts, just the weight. She said I had become too quiet. They stood in the alcove of the bakery doorway out of the rain. "I don't think I can go back to the customs office," D'Estrée added. "No. I'm not sure what I'll do." "You'll find something," Maigret said simply. They parted then, not with a handshake, but with the nod of two men who had already said what needed saying. Later that day, Maigret sat at his desk, with his coat still damp and the window ajar. The sounds of the street below filtered up. Bicycle bells, a man whistling a half-familiar tune, a newspaper vendor barking something about a municipal scandal. Paris, unbothered, alive. Janvier entered with a folder tucked beneath his arm. "Routine files." Maigret gestured toward the desk. "Put them there." Janvier lingered. "You've gone quiet on the D'Estrée matter. There's nothing more to pursue." Janvier looked skeptical. "The man disappears for days, turns up in a chapel, spends years walking around with a memory buried under his collar, and now it's over?" "It was never a crime," Maigret said. "It was a return." Janvier tilted his head. "I don't think I follow." Maigret relit his pipe, the tobacco sparking reluctantly in the damp air. "Some men disappear to escape, others to remember. D'Estrée needed silence to face something he'd spent half his life avoiding. He didn't run. He paused. "You're not filing a report?" "No. I sent a brief note to the commissioner. Explained it as a personal matter. The office will quietly process his retirement, perhaps early. And Cottard. He's not a danger. He's part of the past. If he ever was more than a witness, time has dealt with him more thoroughly than we ever could." Janvier nodded and left. Maigret turned to the window. A boy walked past carrying a violin case too large for his coat. A woman balanced a baguette under one arm while calling after her dog. Somewhere a church bell marked the hour with unhurried clarity. He pulled open a drawer in his desk and removed the postcard. It was never about the money, you know that. But some things cannot be left buried. Tuesday. Same place. C. He folded it neatly and slid it into the case file, which he then locked away. Not every file stayed open, and not every truth needed shouting. That evening at home, Madame Maigret stirred soup on the stove while Maigret read a newspaper he had no real interest in. The radio muttered soft strings. She glanced over once and said, "You look tired." Not tired, just settled. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. She ladled the soup into 2 bowls, wiped her hands, and sat across from him. "How was your day?" "Uneventful," he said. Then, after a pause, "But not meaningless." They ate. Quietly, the spoon against china, their only conversation for a while. And when the rain returned once again, slow, soft, indifferent, Maigret leaned back and let it fall. Outside, the world had not changed, but somewhere on Rue de l'Église, a man had come home, and that for once was enough. The rain ceased sometime during the night. By morning, the rooftops of Paris glistened under a thin sheen of moisture, and the gutters hummed softly as they carried away the remnants of the downpour. Maigret awoke early, but lingered in bed longer than usual. The air held a rare stillness, the sort that made one question whether time had paused or simply slowed to give the city a moment to breathe. He sat at the breakfast table with a bowl of warm milk and chicory, slowly dunking his bread, as the radio in the corner offered a subdued piano sonata. Madame Maigret moved efficiently around the kitchen, preparing her list for the butcher and checking that the radiator by the hallway hadn't stopped clanking again. Neither spoke of D'Estrée. They didn't need to. The name had been folded back into the ordinary fabric of things, like a photograph returned to a drawer, not forgotten but no longer on display. When Maigret arrived at Quai des Orfèvres, The station felt unusually quiet. A few inspectors passed him with polite nods, their arms full of files and their brows furrowed in the unmistakable expression of administrative fatigue. Janvier sat at his desk with his coat draped over the back of his chair, leafing through the morning paper. "Nothing new this morning," he said as Maigret entered. "Nothing expected," Maigret replied. He removed his coat and hung it on. The familiar peg. The scent of pipe smoke and old ink welcomed him like an old friend. He sank into his chair and exhaled with the satisfaction of a man who had not solved a mystery, but lived through it. The file on Jean d'Estrées remained locked in his drawer. It would stay there, not because it was secret, but because it was complete. Later that morning, a clerk from the personnel office brought in a modest folder. "D'Estrées' early retirement. Papers," he said, "backdated as you requested." Maigret opened it and scanned the typed pages. Everything was in order. An amicable exit, citing health reasons. There was even a line about 27 years of faithful service. He signed where needed and closed the folder. That would be the end of it. That afternoon, Maigret took a long, slow walk, not because he had to, but because the air had cleared and the city smelled less of smoke and more of wet stone and soil. He wandered aimlessly, letting his feet choose the direction, past a newspaper stand where schoolboys argued about football results, past a narrow alley where a cat perched like a sentinel on a broken windowsill. Eventually, his path led him back to the neighborhood around Rue de l'Église. He stood for a long moment across the street from the d'Estrées residence, watching. The building as if it might speak to him. A child exited the main door, chased by his mother, who scolded him gently for forgetting his satchel. An older man with a walking stick emerged next, nodded absently at Maigret, and continued toward the tram stop. Then the door opened again. Madame d'Estrées appeared. She wore a dark coat and a navy blue hat that had seen better days. Her movements were precise, unhurried. She carried a cloth bag, probably on her way to the grocer. Maigret didn't call. Out. He waited. She noticed him at last and crossed the street with her usual reserved poise. "Monsieur Maigret." "Madame d'Estrées." They exchanged no handshake, just a brief glance of mutual recognition. "May I walk with you?" he asked. "If you'd like." They moved side by side down the street. "He's sleeping better," she said after a pause. "That's good to hear. Not well, but better. He doesn't wake up at 4 anymore. Has he said anything more?" "Only that he feels as though he's been returned to a room where someone else rearranged the furniture." Maigret allowed himself a faint smile. "And how do you feel?" She stopped and looked at him. "I don't know. Part of me wants to scold him. Another part just wants to keep stirring the soup. We were used to silence, you know. But now, it has." "Wait." Maigret nodded. "Sometimes silence says more than words." They resumed walking. "I think he's afraid it will all come back. That he'll forget what he felt in that chapel. That he'll fall into routine again, and the guilt will settle instead of fade." "That's possible." She looked at him, not accusingly, but with gentle curiosity. "And you, Inspector, what do you think happens next?" Maigret took his time replying. "I think he'll change, a little. Not completely. No one ever does. But enough to know he doesn't want to forget." "That's something." She accepted the answer with a small nod. At the grocer's she stopped. "I go in alone from here." "Of course." She hesitated a moment. "Thank you," she said. He watched her disappear through the grocer's door, then turned and made his way back toward the Seine. That evening after supper, Maigret sat in his usual chair, pipe in hand. Madame Maigret read beside him, a quiet novel in her lap. Outside, the rain had not returned, but the sky had resumed its overcast stillness. "There was a funeral today," Madame Maigret said suddenly. "I passed it near the Rue du Temple." "Oh? A small one. No more than 10 mourners. A woman was crying. Not loudly, just honestly." Maigret didn't ask more. After a while she said, "There are people who leave without ever going anywhere." He looked at her. She didn't lift her eyes from her book. "Yes," he said. "And sometimes there are those who go far, only to return to the same chair, hoping it will forgive them." She smiled faintly and turned the page. Maigret let his pipe go out and leaned back. The city was still. No crime to chase, no declarations. Only a quiet echo of something past, something understood. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. It no longer carried rain, but it carried the weight of something recently spoken, and the hush that follows when a door quietly closes behind a man who once left at dawn and found the strength at last to come home. The days that followed were unremarkable by any police standard. No murders, no runaway trains, no missing aristocrats found in suitcases. Even the usual flood of petty thefts and drunkards sleeping in public squares seemed to ebb, as if Paris itself had exhaled and decided briefly to let things be. Maigret had spent 3 mornings in the same café near the Quai des Orfèvres, not the one with the noisy brass lamp and the sour milk, but the quieter one tucked beside the stationery shop, where the sugar bowls never went missing and the waitress didn't need to ask how he took his coffee. He brought no files, no folders, only his pipe and the habit of watching. On the 3rd morning, as he stirred the bottom of his cup, the door opened and someone entered with the clumsy care of a man unsure of his reception. Jean d'Estrées. He removed. His hat scanned the café, and when his eyes met Maigret's, he didn't smile. He only nodded like a student late to class. Without asking, he joined Maigret's table and placed his gloves on the worn wood between them. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said quietly, "and yet you came." D'Estrées exhaled, more from habit than from fatigue. "I started walking this morning and somehow my feet led me here." "That happens more often than you think," Maigret replied. A brief silence passed. D'Estrées spoke again. "I've been to the customs office." Maigret looked at him. "Not to ask for my job back," he clarified, "to hand over my keys. I thought about mailing them, but that felt evasive." "And how did it go?" "No one said much. The man at the desk barely looked up. I told him who I was, and he just asked if I had anything that belonged to the department. I gave him the keys, and that was that. And I felt nothing. Not pride, not relief. Just an ending." "That's something," Maigret said. D'Estrées nodded. "I've been helping my neighbor repaint her shutters," he added. "She lost her husband 2 winters ago. The shutters had begun to rot." Maigret looked at him. "Volunteering?" "I suppose. She tried to pay me in soup. I told her it wasn't necessary. It never is, but people offer what they can." Another silence. D'Estrées' fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup. "There's something else," he said. "Something I haven't said. Something I didn't even tell my wife." Maigret leaned back slightly, pipe idle in his hand. "The day I disappeared that morning, I left with the idea that I might not come back." "You'd planned that far?" "No, not in detail. But the thought was there. I had taken some cash, a change of shirt in my pocket, a list of old addresses, people I hadn't spoken to in years. I had no clear destination, but I had options. I stood on the east platform and imagined getting on the next train to Lyon, or even farther." "And why didn't you?" D'Estrées paused. "I saw a man helping a blind woman onto the train. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a passerby, She didn't thank him. She didn't even know he had helped her. But he stood there a moment after she boarded, looking at her window. Then he walked away. And that changed your mind? No. It reminded me of something. That we leave marks even when we don't intend to. That even unnoticed actions matter. I realized I couldn't just vanish, not without placing a weight on someone else's shoulders. Maigret looked out the window. A child across the street was pressing his face against a bakery window, breath fogging the glass. His mother tugged him away, but the boy lingered, his eyes fixed on a single tart topped with raspberries. "You were always going to return," Maigret said. D'Estrées gave a slow nod. "Yes." They sat a while longer, the waitress clearing a nearby table, the clatter of saucers like punctuation in the quiet. Then Maigret asked, "What about Cottard?" "He won't say anything. He doesn't need to. We both know what we know. That's enough." Maigret agreed. "Do you want me to speak with him?" "No, let it settle. We both lived through the same fog. He has his own ledger, I have mine." They finished their coffee without words. When they rose to leave, Maigret placed a franc beside his saucer. D'Estrées reached for his coat. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For treating this like something worth understanding." Maigret didn't answer. He only nodded and stepped into the morning light, his coat already damp at the shoulders. Later that day, Maigret passed through the main hall of the precinct where a clerk sat updating ledgers, recording retirements, reassignments, transfers. On a whim, Maigret paused beside him. "Let me see the retirement list," he said. The clerk handed over the binder. Maigret scanned the names: clerks, typists, a night sergeant who'd finally been given a fishing license for his years of service. Then near the bottom he found it. D'Estrées, Jean Customs Officer, Grade 4, service concluded May 5th. Cause: early retirement health provision. Note: no disciplinary actions, no commendations. Maigret smiled faintly at that last line. "No commendations," he murmured. The clerk looked up. "Something missing?" "No, just right." He returned the folder and left. That evening at home, Madame Maigret laid a checkered cloth over the table. A roast simmered in the oven, the scent of rosemary and garlic threading through the flat. She turned on the wireless, and a low-voiced announcer spoke of an art exhibit opening in the Marais. "Did the rain return?" she asked as Maigret removed his shoes by the door. "No, but the wind's stronger." He settled into his chair as she poured 2 small glasses of vermouth. She sat opposite him. "Did he seem different today?" she asked. "Yes, like a man who'd found where to place his shame." "And is that enough?" "For now." They drank slowly. In the window, the street lamp outside flickered. A woman passed beneath it holding a basket of pears. A dog barked 2 blocks away and was answered by another. Maigret leaned his head back, the glass resting between his palms. It was not the end of the story, not truly, but it was the right page to turn. Outside, Paris remained unchanged, but behind one modest window on Rue de l'Église, a man was no longer waiting to be found. He had already returned, the final report never made. It to the commissioner's desk. It sat instead in the locked drawer of Maigret's office, beside a half-used packet of pipe tobacco and a yellowing newspaper, with the crossword half finished in Madame Maigret's careful script. He had intended to write something official, something that would wrap up Jean d'Estrées' absence with the proper bureaucratic bow. But each time he sat down, pen poised above the page, the facts resisted arrangement. There was no arrest. No definitive resolution, only the quiet return of a man who had spent his life avoiding a single question. That, Maigret thought, was not something the administration would know how to file. On the 3rd morning after d'Estrées' return, Maigret walked through the iron gates of Père Lachaise cemetery. It was not his habit to wander graveyards, but a funeral notice in the back of the Gazette had caught his eye. Paul Cottard, 64, deceased quietly in his sleep, interment by municipal order. No family, no priest, no mourning ribbon tied to a black umbrella. Cottard had died alone in the top floor of the Rue des Quatre Frères boarding house, 2 days after his conversation with Maigret. The landlady had found him sitting in the same chair by the window, his cup of chicory cold and untouched. A heart, perhaps, or simply a life concluding its natural, lonely rhythm. There were no flowers at the graveside. Just a shovel leaned against the earth, and a municipal worker leaning into his collar against the wind. Maigret stood at a respectful distance, coat buttoned to the top, his hat pulled low. He didn't stay long, just long enough. On his way out, he passed a small family tomb with a cracked angel above it. Someone had placed a single red carnation on the stone, not fresh, not entirely wilted. It stood out against the granite, defiant and quiet, like so many things in Paris. The rest of the day unfolded in the usual fashion. A petty fraud case involving a counterfeit art certificate, a complaint about a missing canary from a retired librarian, and a young inspector with too much ambition and too little tact interrupting Maigret during lunch. But even as the day returned to its predictable rhythm, something within it felt quieter, not somber, just stilled. That afternoon, Maigret found himself walking once again near Rue de l'Église. He wasn't expected. He had no official business. But something in him wanted to see the house one last time, to witness its return to routine with his own eyes. He arrived just as the postman was sliding letters through the brass slot in the door. The shutters on the second floor were open, and a faint silhouette moved inside. A woman dusting or perhaps straightening curtains. From the open window came the faintest strain of a radio broadcast, and the smell of something baking. Onions, perhaps, and butter. Jean d'Estrées emerged moments later. He wore no coat, just a cardigan buttoned up the front, and he carried a small pail of water and a scrubbing brush. He knelt beside the stone steps and began cleaning moss from between the joints with quiet care. He looked up, saw Maigret, and didn't stand. He merely raised a hand in greeting and returned to his work. Maigret crossed the street. "Good afternoon, Inspector. You're working today. I find it helps." Maigret watched him scrub in a patient rhythm. The scent of the pail's vinegar mixture drifted up with the dampness of the stone. "I read about Cottard," d'Estrées said without looking up. "Yes. He was alone, wasn't he?" "Yes." D'Estrées' hand paused on the brush. "Do you think he felt peace before it happened?" Maigret thought for a moment. "I think he said what he needed to say. That's not always the same thing." "No," Maigret admitted, "but sometimes it's enough." d'Estrées nodded. "He wasn't a bad man. No, just tired." They stood in silence as a cyclist passed, the rattle of his chain, slicing the quiet. After a time, d'Estrées said, "I've started writing things down." "A diary?" "Not quite. More like records, memories, names I remember, things I did, things I didn't do. I don't know what I'll do with it, but it helps." "You should keep writing," Maigret said. "I don't expect it to change anything." "It doesn't have to." They looked at one another, not as officer and citizen, but as men, of equal weariness, each carrying something invisible and old. Maigret took a step back. "Do you still go to the chapel?" "Sometimes, not as often." "And your wife?" "She's beginning to trust the silences again." "That's something." D'Estrées stood and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Do you believe people change, Inspector?" "I believe they remember. and sometimes that's the same thing. D'Estrées looked down at the brush in his hand, then back at the doorstep. I'm repainting these next week. She picked the color. What is it? Celery Clair. Maigret smiled. A good choice, not too bold. No, but different enough. They parted without ceremony. That evening, Maigret sat at home as the light waned outside the windows. Madame Maigret read beside him, knitting now instead of reading, her fingers as steady as a metronome. He hadn't told her about Cottard's death. She would see the notice eventually. When she did, she'd say nothing, only sigh, perhaps, and place the paper face down. She glanced up. Soup or stew tomorrow? Stew. With carrots? Of course. That was all. Later, as the city settled into its evening hush, Maigret walked to the window and looked out across the narrow courtyard. Someone had left a light on in a laundry room. A man smoked on a balcony across the way. A dog barked, was shushed, then barked again. He thought of all the lives unfolding at once, the tiny dramas, the invisible griefs, the unnoticed kindnesses. So many stories, none of them grand, all of them weighty. He returned to his chair and poured a small glass of plum brandy, the good one, from the locked cabinet, and sat without speaking. Somewhere, not far, a man was painting his stone steps, and the city kept breathing, and the quiet for once held. 3 weeks passed. There were days Maigret did not think of Jean d'Estrées at all. Then, without warning, something, a voice on the radio, a coat left draped over a café chair, the way someone folded their napkin too precisely, would bring him back. Not as a case, not as a problem, but as a quiet tether to the small weight of human memory. It was a Thursday when the envelope arrived. He found it waiting on his desk at Quai des Orfèvres, placed carefully to one side by Janvier, who had scribbled on a slip of paper, "No return address. Delivered by hand." Maigret didn't open it right away. He finished his coffee, read through a brief report on a misrouted delivery of Romanian boots, and scrawled a note to a colleague in the 18th arrondissement regarding a theft involving a church bell clapper. Then, as the office quieted, he reached for the envelope. It was thick, handwritten, the flap sealed with the sort of care that suggested deliberation rather than urgency. Inside, a sheaf of closely written pages folded once. No greeting, no date, just the first line. "You asked me once if I believed people could change. This is my answer." Maigret read for nearly half an hour, unmoving, the only sound the occasional scratch of Janvier's chair in the next room, and the low ticking of the office wall clock. The pages were not a confession, nor were they a memoir. They were each fragments. D'Estrées' handwriting was neat but softened, the edges of his words worn down by time. He described moments, not events, the smell of the customs office in Dunkirk. During winter, a colleague who whistled until noon each day, then fell silent. A little boy he saw on a train who asked his mother whether clouds had names. And then the memories grew more pointed. He wrote of the shipment, not to name it, but to name what he felt afterward. A wrongness he couldn't place, a silence from his superiors, the slow change in how people spoke to him, how no one accused, but no one confided either. It is a strange thing, guilt without prosecution, like a stain no one mentions, but everyone avoids sitting near. He wrote about the chapel, too, about the moment the silence settled over him like a coat that finally fit. You think you will collapse when the truth comes. But it doesn't arrive like a hammer. It arrives like fog, slow, surrounding you until you realize you've already stopped moving. Toward the end of the letter, a short paragraph stood alone. "I'm not a new man, but I am no longer the one who needed to run. That may be all the change I'm entitled to." Maigret folded the pages and placed them gently back into the envelope. He locked them in the drawer with the case file. That was where they belonged. Not with the active files, not in the official ledger, but in the quiet drawer where memory was stored. That evening, Maigret didn't return home straight away. Instead, he took the longer route by the canal. The spring air was warmer now, the first real warmth of the season. Young couples sat on benches, their jackets beside them instead of worn. Someone played a concertina from an open window above a tabak. The notes were uneven, halting but sincere. He walked until the city dimmed, until the gas lamps had begun to glow and the shopkeepers pulled in their signs. And then, drawn by something he wouldn't name, he turned toward Rue de l'Église. There were no plans, no reason. Only the shape of a conclusion nudging him forward. The building was the same. Quiet. Shutters painted in a fresh, pale green. Celery clair, as D'Estrées had said. The color was modest, but different enough from the grey-white it had been to mark the change. He didn't knock. He only stood across the street for a time. At one point, the curtains on the second floor shifted. A figure appeared, a man in a brown pullover holding a book. He stood at the window, glanced at the street, then stepped back out of view. That was enough. At home, Maigret found Madame Maigret embroidering by lamplight. The kitchen smelled of baked apples. "You're late," she said. "I took the long way." She didn't press. She never did. He poured himself a small glass of marc and joined her. For a time they sat in companionable silence, broken only by the click of her needle and the distant clang of a tram bell outside. Eventually she looked up. Did something happen today? Yes. What kind of something? The quiet kind. She smiled faintly. Those are the hardest to notice. Maigret nodded. Then, after a pause, "A man wrote me a letter." "Someone you knew?" "In a way." "And what did he say?" Maigret considered this. "That he has stopped running. That he is learning how to live where he stands." Madame Maigret lowered her embroidery, hands still. "That's rare." "Yes." They said nothing more. Before bed, Maigret stood at the window and looked out across the courtyard. Most windows were dark now. A cat sat on a rooftop, its tail twitching lazily. Somewhere a radio played dance music from another era, faint and crackling like a memory one could hum but never name. In the corner of the windowsill sat a book. He picked it up. It was an old volume of short stories by Maupassant. Inside the front cover, in faded blue ink, someone had written, "To Jules, some endings never arrive." But some pages do. Maigret returned it to the shelf. As he undressed, he thought again of the letter. There had been no ending to D'Estrées' story, no final twist, only a choice to stop hiding and the difficult work of living afterward. And perhaps that was all a mystery like this ever needed. Not a culprit, not a motive, but a man once lost who came back before he was gone, and found, in the quiet between dawn and dusk, the courage to turn the page. It was late spring now, the kind of Parisian late spring that felt less like a season, and more like an exhale. The breeze was no longer sharp, only curious. The chestnut trees cast dappled shadows across benches, and women in modest dresses hung bedding from second-story windows with unhurried hands. Rain had given way to damp, earth and distant birdsong. Maigret found himself watching the world more than usual. He stood at a kiosk along the Boulevard Saint-Michel, thumbing through newspapers he'd already read and journals he hadn't. Beside him, a man in spectacles examined the same copy of Le Figaro Littéraire for 10 minutes, without turning the page. No one spoke. The city breathed, and Maigret let it breathe around him. There were no calls for him at the office that day, no complaints, no arrests. Even Janvier had taken the afternoon off to help his sister move a gas heater. So Maigret walked. Not with purpose, but with gravity. the kind that draws certain men back to the same streets, the same corners, as if the stones themselves remember where you've been. He passed the old watchmaker's shop where he once took his pipe to be repaired. The man had died 5 years earlier. His son ran it now. The windows looked cleaner but less honest. He passed an alley where, in 1947, a painter had been found strangled with a curtain cord. That case had never been solved, not from lack of evidence, but because no one had truly wanted the answer. Sometimes mysteries stay open because the truth would change too much. Eventually, Maigret reached the edge of the Seine and sat on a bench across from the water, the current slow and brown, sunlight bouncing off its surface in patient strokes. He took out his pipe but didn't light it. He only held it, fingers curled around the familiar grain of the wood. In his pocket, folded carefully, was the final page of d'Estrées' letter. He had left it unread when the rest of the letter arrived. Intentionally, a decision made without reason. Only today had he felt the moment was right. He unfolded it now. "Inspector, I imagine you sitting with this in your hand, already knowing everything I might write next, but I'll write it anyway for my own sake. I used to think my life was a series of forms filled correctly, items ticked, tasks completed. That precision would protect me, that if I did everything as expected, no one could ever question who I was. But I forgot something, that a man is not made from what he avoids, but what he faces. You taught me that, not by saying it, but by how you stood there in silence when I had no excuse left. I am not healed, but I am living. That is perhaps the closest thing to redemption that any man deserves." J.D. Maigret read it twice, then folded it slowly and returned it to his coat. Across the river, a school group walked by, boys, with loose collars and girls with skipping ropes tied to their satchels. One of them pointed at a barge and asked, "Where do you think that boat is going?" The teacher replied, "Away." The boy seemed satisfied. Maigret smiled. Later that evening, he arrived home to the scent of lentils simmering on the stove and the sound of a knife gently tapping against a cutting board. Madame Maigret looked up as he entered, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're late again." "I walked." "Far?" "Far enough to remember something." She returned to her chopping. "Anything worth repeating?" He considered this as he removed his coat and hat. "Yes, but nothing worth correcting." They ate in near silence. The stew was rich, the bread crusty. The tablecloth had a small wine stain near the edge, one neither of them had bothered to remove. It was familiar, like a misplaced key that never got found but was no longer needed. Afterward, she brought him a small slice of tart and sat beside him with a sewing basket. "What will you do with the letter?" she asked, not looking up. "I'll keep it." "For the file?" "No, for me." They didn't speak again for several minutes. The ticking of the clock above the sideboard kept pace with the distant traffic. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, a gramophone played a tango too slow for dancing. At last, Maigret stood and walked to the window. The city shimmered beneath a faint blue haze, not quite dusk, not yet night. The in-between. In a few hours the cafés would fill again. Men would take off their jackets and argue over nothing. Lovers would lean into one another as if the world were ending in 10 minutes. Someone would lie. Someone would regret something. And someone else, likely unnoticed, would carry it all in silence. As they always had. He thought of Jean d'Estrées. He imagined him sitting with his wife now, perhaps in their modest kitchen, reading aloud from the newspaper. Not dramatic, not even significant, just present. And for the first time since the man had walked out before dawn, Maigret no longer felt the need to watch for his return. He had come back, Not in triumph, not in absolution, but in the only way men like him ever do. Quietly, with humility, with unfinished things still in their pockets. Maigret turned away from the window and returned to his chair. The tart was gone. His pipe waited beside his drink, and outside, as the last of the day gave way to night, the wind stirred nothing but the leaves. Not every case ends in justice, but sometimes it ends in truth. And that, Maigret thought, was enough.